Hey there, I'm Emily Muhlstein, and this is a public hearing video for Amendment 20 to the Coastal Migratory Pelagic Fisheries Management Plan, and it deals with commercial trip limits, seasons, transit provisions, and allocation. The Gulf and South Atlantic Fisheries Management Councils manage coastal migratory pelagics jointly. This amendment is considering whether or not the current commercial trip limits, fishing seasons, and other regulations provide for the greatest benefit to the coastal migratory pelagic fishery. We'll start with Action 1, which deals with commercial hook and line trip limits for Gulf Group king mackerel. So right now, the western zone has a 3,000 pound trip limit, and both the eastern northern subzone and the eastern southern subzone have a 1,250 pound trip limit until 75% of the quota is harvested, and then the trip limit gets reduced to 500 pounds. So the Council's considering changing those trip limits. The first alternative is the no action alternative, and right now the South Atlantic and Gulf preferred option is to do that for the western zone, and we also have the option of choosing the eastern northern subzone or the eastern southern subzone as well. The second alternative considers setting the trip limit at 2,500 pounds with no reduction for any of the three zones. The third alternative would set the trip limit at 3,000 pounds with no reduction, and we have the option of doing that for any of the zones. Currently, the South Atlantic and Gulf preferred option would set a 3,000 pound trip limit for the eastern zone's southern subzone. And the fourth alternative would be to set a trip limit at 1,250 pounds with no reduction. We could do that for any three of the zones, and right now the current preferred for South Atlantic and also the Gulf Council would be to do that for the eastern zone northern subzone. Moving on to Action 2, which considers the fishing season for eastern and western zones of Gulf king mackerel. Kingfish tend to move closer to shore off of South Louisiana in the fall, and so opening the season later in the year might allow fishermen to harvest fish more effectively, but at the same time it might make weather conditions a little bit more dangerous for fishing. The Gulf Group king mackerel in the eastern and western zone currently opens July 1st and closes on June 30th of the following year. So there are three alternatives in this action. The first is the no action alternative, and that would keep the season opening date on July 1st. The second alternative would open the season on September 1st. The South Atlantic has selected that as their preferred alternative for all zones in the Gulf, and the Gulf Council has selected that as their preferred alternative for the western zone only. And then the third alternative is to open the season on October 1st, and the Gulf Council has expressed that it is their preferred option to set an October 1 opening date for the eastern zone northern subzone. So the third action considers transit for traveling through areas that are close to king mackerel fishermen. Currently, king mackerel fishermen cannot bring their catch from an open zone through a closed zone to land at a fish house. This is especially troublesome for fishermen in Monroe and Collier counties. The first alternative is the no action alternative. The second alternative would allow transit for vessels that are possessing Atlantic Group king mackerel that are legally harvested in the exclusive economic zone off of Monroe County through the eastern zone, northern, and southern subzones when those zones are closed. The third alternative would allow transit for vessels possessing Atlantic Group king mackerel through Collier County when the eastern zone southern subzone is closed, and that's from April 1st through June 30th only. The South Atlantic and Gulf preferred alternative, which is alternative 4, would allow transit for all vessels possessing king mackerel that were legally harvested in the exclusive economic zone through areas that are close to king mackerel fishing. And then the fifth alternative would allow transit for vessels that are possessing king mackerel that were legally harvested in the exclusive economic zone off of Collier County through the eastern zone northern subzone when that area is closed. Just keep in mind for alternatives 2 through 5 that transit through a closed area requires that vessels are in direct and continuous transit with their gear stowed, and that it only applies to fishermen that hold federal commercial king mackerel permits. Action 4 considers establishing regional annual catch limits for Atlantic Group king mackerel and Spanish mackerel. Currently, both Atlantic Group king mackerel and Atlantic Group Spanish mackerel are managed with single commercial annual catch limits throughout their range. Action 4.1 focuses on king mackerel, and Action 4.2 focuses on Spanish mackerel. Now the alternatives in both those actions are the same, and so I'll just discuss them from here on out as sort of one selection, but you would have to choose for each species which alternative you prefer. So the first alternative would be the no action alternative. That wouldn't create regional annual catch limits. The second alternative would establish separate commercial annual catch limits for the state of North Carolina. Alternative 3 would establish annual catch limits for northern and southern zones, and that zone boundary would be between North and South Carolina. National Marine Fisheries Service would monitor landings and close the exclusive economic zone when each annual catch limit was reached. And then Alternative 4 would allow for the transfer of quota between regions, and that can be selected in addition to one of the other alternatives. So there are some sub-options here for selecting annual catch limits for both alternatives 2 and 3. The first option would be to use historical landings from 2008 to 2012 to establish those annual catch limits. The second option would be to use landings from 2003 through 2012. Option C would use 50% of the landings from 2008 to 2012 and 50% of the landings from 2003 through 2012. And then the final option, option D, would use landings from 1998 all the way through 2012. So there are different options for monitoring and implementing the second alternative, which would establish an annual catch limit for the state of North Carolina. Option E would allow National Marine Fisheries Service to monitor landings and close each area when the annual catch limits are met. Option F would require North Carolina to monitor and prohibit landings when the annual catch limit is met, and then National Marine Fisheries Service would monitor and close the rest of the exclusive economic zone. Option G would allow North Carolina to monitor their annual catch limits and then inform National Marine Fisheries Service when their annual catch limit is met, and then National Marine Fisheries Service would monitor the rest of the exclusive economic zone and close each area when the annual catch limits are met. So moving on to Action 5, which would modify the framework procedure. A framework procedure is a standard way to make management changes that are already included in a fisheries management plans. There are circumstances under which the framework action can be used, and there are prescribed responses to different issues that are defined in that framework. The Coastal Migratory Pelagic Framework was developed in Amendment 18. So the first alternative, as always, is the no action alternative, and that would keep the framework procedure as it is. The second alternative, which is the Gulf and South Atlantic Council's preferred alternative, would modify the framework procedure to include some changes to acceptable biological catches, annual catch limit control rules, and accountability measures. You can see here it would allow for changes in the in-season accountability measures, which include closures and closing procedures, trip limit reductions and increases, the designation of an individual fishing quota program as an accountability measure for certain species, implementation of gear restriction, reduction of the annual catch limit to account for the previous year's overage, revoking a scheduled increase in the annual catch limit if the annual catch limit was exceeded in the previous year, implementing gear restrictions, and reporting and monitoring requirements. And then the post-season accountability measures that would be changed under Alternative 2 include adjustment of season length, implementation of a closed season, and adjustment or implementation of a bag, trip, or possession limit. Alternative 3 would also modify the framework procedure to include some changes to accountability measures. The in-season accountability measures that could be changed under Alternative 3 include the closure procedures and reductions or increases in trip limits, and the post-season accountability measures that could be changed would include adjustments of season lengths and adjustment of bag, trip, or possession limits. Alternative 4, which is also a South Atlantic and Gulf preferred alternative, would modify the framework procedure to include designation of responsibility for each council for setting regulations for the migratory group of each species. And Alternative 5, which is also preferred by both councils, would allow councils to make editorial changes to the framework procedure to reflect changes to council advisory committees and panels. And finally, Action 6 deals with modifications to the annual catch limits and annual catch targets for cobia. There is currently a Gulf Migratory Group annual catch limit that applies only to the Gulf jurisdiction, and there's also a South Atlantic annual catch limit that applies to the South Atlantic jurisdiction. The annual catch limits and annual catch targets were established in Amendment 18. In the Gulf, the annual catch limit for cobia is 1,460,000 pounds, and the stock annual catch target is 1,310,000 pounds. In the South Atlantic, the annual catch limit is 1,571,399 pounds, and the recreational annual catch target is 1,184,688 pounds. The first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would keep the annual catch limits and annual catch targets as they are. The second alternative would set the annual catch limits equal to the acceptable biological catch levels that were determined by the Scientific and Statistical Committee for each migratory group. You can see this table below what the annual catch limits and annual catch targets would be under this alternative. The third alternative would determine an annual catch limit for each jurisdictional area, and the Gulf Migratory Group cobia annual catch limit would be divided into a Gulf jurisdictional annual catch limit and then an East Coast of Florida annual catch limit based on the following options. Option A would use landings from 2003 through 2012. Option B would use landings from 2008 to 2012. Option C would use 50% of landings from 2003 through 2012 plus 50% of landings from 2008 through 2012. The current South Atlantic and Gulf preferred option would use landings from 1998 through 2012. And then option D, which is based on yellowtail, would use 50% of the average landings from 1993 through 2008 plus 50% of average landings from 2006 to 2008. Option E, based on mutton snapper, would use 50% of the average landings from 1990 through 2008 and 50% of landings from 2006 through 2008. This table shows you the different options and the resulting annual catch limits and annual catch targets. So we'd like to hear from you if you have opinions on the actions and alternatives contained within this amendment. You can find the full document. You can send us your comments using our online comment form, and you're also welcome to send us an email at gulfcouncil@gulfcouncil.org. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch the presentation and give us your opinions.